Okay, everyone. I think that we're ready to start. As Julia mentioned earlier, I'm Jacob McGuinn, and that's enough of an introduction to me for now, I think. But I'm just going to be chairing this afternoon, so thanks for coming back. We have as our first speaker Professor Sumi Madhok, who is a Professor of Political Theory and Gender Studies and the Head of Department of Gender Studies at LSE. Her work combines critical theory and ethnographic approaches with a focus on South Asia, and is interested in social sciences focused on epistemic interventions in the global South. Her latest book is Vernacular Rights Cultures, The Politics of Origins, Human Rights and the Struggle for Justice, which came out of Cambridge in 2021, and was also the winner, as we were just discussing, of the 2022 Susan Strange Book Award and the Sussex International Theory Award, and it also received the International Studies Association Lee and Fujii Book Prize honourable mention. So a much lauded event. And Sumi's going to speak to us for about 45 minutes. We'll then have some time for questions and then our next two speakers.
That's not a great start. Oh, wow.
Well, please join me in welcoming.
Thank you all. Thanks very much for coming back after lunch. And thank you for this morning. It was just, I think as Pine said, these spaces are few and far between, spaces of intellectual generosity and engagement, and increasingly contracting under all sorts of pressures. I also wanted to, so thank you, Jacob, for that introduction, and also thank you to Julia. As Julia was sort of saying in the morning, that this is an extremely difficult time to be an academic in the UK system. And as Julia's own colleagues, 97 of them have been served redundancy notices, and I wanted to actually articulate my solidarity with colleagues at Goldsmiths, many of whom I know, friends of mine, and whose work I engage with and learn from every day, both in the classroom and in my own writing. I also want to say thank you to Julia again for getting us all together, but also, this has been a very hard time also for Julia's project, given this context. And it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy in most kind of normal times to put together events like this, and in this a particular time, even more so. So thank you very much, Julia. I'm going to speak a little bit about what have I done, in this. So I come here. I'm going to speak a little bit about anti-imperial epistemic justice. This is also, in the same vein as this morning speakers. It's very new work. It actually is kind of new in a sense that this is something I've begun working on in the last, I'd say 6, 7, 8, 9 months or so. But it's been very, very slow for various kinds of reasons. But also, in some ways, I feel it's not also so new because it arises out of some of my long-standing engagements. And it always happens when you finish a book, the book that Jacob mentioned, that you suddenly realize just as it's about to go into print, and you think, wait a minute, there is a larger question here which I haven't actually managed to get to. Well, because I haven't been able to get to because it would take another book or several books and so on. And by that time, I think my publisher was getting very touchy and just said, so send it. And so this is this is the larger question, which actually the book on Vernacular Rights Cultures skirts around, but doesn't kind of tackle it in the way that I want to do. So this is the new work and new thinking, which I'm slowly making my way through. So I will speak a little bit about anti-imperial epistemic justice. I'm actually going to stick my neck out here, and that could be because, I'm still in the fresh flushes of this work, and so I feel I have a little more courage to say stuff, and then I'll kind of claw back, right, as it goes, as in the next few months or so. And I'm going to sort of stick my neck out and say that this is actually, anti-imperial epistemic justice is crucial to knowledge production from most of the world. And what will happen in the next 42, 43, 44 minutes or so, I'll speak of some of the key interventions that anti-imperial epistemic justice makes And one of the key and one important intervention and critique that it does make, and there's several, is one of methodological abstraction. And in order to keep faithful to that intervention of the critique of methodological abstraction, I'm going to try and not be abstract in what I'm going to talk about, because this can be a very abstract way of thinking about some of those questions that I want to. And what I'll do then is I'll go back to some of my familiar territory where it all began, which is to talk about anti-imperial epistemic justice through my engagements with rights politics in most of the world. And as I said, in fact, I came to think about this question through my work on rights politics. And then I'm going to talk about what does thinking through the prism of anti-imperial epistemic justice do to thinking about rights politics in most of the world. I'm very aware that actually it is a very disheartening time to speak of rights and human rights. The debris of international human rights regimes has been staring at us starkly in the face since October last year. And yet it is also a time when no other conceptual, ethical, or moral language seems equipped to take its place. So we're in this sort of impasse. But of course, speaking of impasses, the critique of human rights has also been in an impasse for decades and decades, and that critique hasn't fared too well either. There is an all too familiar exhaustion and impatience with critiques of global human rights, not least because, as feminist legal scholar Ratna Kapoor notes, the steady flow upon critique of global human rights has been all too successful in mobilizing despair, but done very little to explore alternative epistemic routes through which to think about human rights. But even the critique of global human rights, now I'm not even talking about the usual sort of, celebratory or sort of, the work or the detractors, right? So I'm not talking about the celebrants or the detractors. Let's just keep our eyes fixated on the critiques themselves, the radical critique coming from radical democratic theory. But even the critique of global human rights doesn't address the problems of historiographies, philosophical discourses, and the provincial nature of human rights thinking and application. Consider, for instance, how even critical human rights scholarship has only ever told very limited and particular stories of human rights, excising out of its purviews stories of anti-colonial struggles and those of liberation and justice as comprising human rights struggles. So you do not find in any of those historiographies, or even the radical critical ones, that stories of anti-colonial struggles, for example, appearing as part of the kind of standard historiography of human rights. Having said this, I also have felt strongly for many, many years that the work of critique must only ever be one part of the story. We cannot rest our laurels on critique alone. Although I hugely take your point that critique is both, being critical but also offering possibilities of renewal and change. Critiques are hugely useful and significant in demystifying the constellations of power and their entanglements must only be the starting point for the production of new intellectual and conceptual histories, geographies, and epistemologies, and in this particular case of rights politics from different locations around the globe. These different stories of human rights are important because they allow us to progress through critique of global human rights towards new political imaginaries and conceptualizations of rights politics. You'll see that I'm not talking about human rights, I'm talking about rights politics. And so doing, start the important work of shifting the epistemic center of rights scholarship. But how do you tell different stories of human rights and of rights politics in most of the world? It's all very fine to say that, but how do you do that? For quite a few years now, I've been writing about rights politics in most of the world. By most of the world, in the first instance, I take it from Bharti Chatterjee's phrase, but I refuse the binarism of geopolitical imaginaries and the epistemic authority attached to these. Most of the world refers to epistemic thinking and world-making outside of methodological nationalism, heteropatriarchal and caste supremacist contexts, but also those which are outside standard Eurocentered and North Atlantic epistemologies. So how to tell stories of rights that are not only ever those of their origins, right? constantly. That's the story we're always told. Look at the way human rights curricula start from the American Declaration, right, and so on. So there's always a story of origin. Or the powerful efforts by the powerful, including by nation states, to institutionalize global human rights. All of standard IR, international relations and politics, political science is very much around that. All of the unidirectional travel, translation, or vernacularization, in other words, all the anthropological work is on that. Or indeed those about the humanitarian and military interventions by global powers. And how not to tell stories of different human rights where difference is enacted through categorizing difference as cultural, custom, local, or as case studies of global human rights talk. Think about the ways in which we often tell our students, this is the normative, and now produce case studies of how this might occur. That concept of case studies constantly keeps coming up. The power of Eurocentric frameworks is such that they convert those other places into case studies, or into the local, and as devoid of epistemic authority, or as having something to say that matters epistemically. And finally, how to refuse standardly narrated stories of human rights that speak of difference, but while keeping the epistemic frameworks of global human rights intact and impervious to serious consideration of the difference that historical difference makes to human rights talk. So for some years now, I've been insisting to tell different stories of world making around rights and human rights. I tell a story of vernacular rights cultures. The stories of vernacular rights cultures foreground the struggles for rights and justice by subaltern groups in most of the world. So these are stories of critical conceptual vocabularies, subaltern mobilizations, and of conflictual gendered politics of rights. They are stories and struggles for economic redistributive justice, but also for representational justice. And they're stories of conceptual diversity, of oppositional politics, of protest against authoritarianism and militarism, and the political imaginaries that animate subaltern rights politics, but also open up different futures and possibilities for rights and human rights around the globe. Importantly, though, these stories refuse the inordinate preoccupation with the racialized, originary, and binary global human rights talk, or what I call the politics of origins. The politics of origins stipulates, very quite simply, the politics of origins, this is very familiar to you, you would know this instantly. The politics of origins stipulates that human rights originate, belong, travel from, and operate for the West. This politics of origins is shared by not only the celebrators and detractors of human rights, but also by critical and progressive scholarship on human rights. The politics of origins organizes the global human rights discourse into a series of binary distinctions. Some of them are very familiar to you. Key ones being the West and non-West. Are human rights Western? Right? Think about how many times we ask our students to think about this. Or universalism versus particularism. Are human rights universalist? Right? Are they universal or are they particularist? Or indeed Asian values versus Western political and civil human rights, and so on. Now, the politics of origins is not without consequences. None of these things ever are. In the hands of authoritarian nation states, it places a politically expedient argument to delegitimize modes of democratic protest and questioning of excessive state power on the basis that human rights are illegitimate, alien, foreign, and therefore with little cultural traction and legitimacy. Think about the ways in which authoritarian nation states clamp down on political dissent, or indeed think about all the ways in which it clamps down on all kinds of movements, oppositional movements, including feminist movements, deeming them as Western, alien, and so on and so forth. In critical progressive scholarship on human rights, on the other hand, this originary story shores up the West as the epistemic subject of human rights, although this time via critique, mainly by displaying willful ignorance and epistemic erasure of right struggles in most of the world. Now, by this I mean that you could be the most radical democratic theorist, right, writing on right struggles in most of the world, but you are under no obligation to know what's happening about right struggles in most of the world at all. So your models for thinking about rights politics then become the American Declaration and the French Revolution. So think about Etienne Balibar, think about Jacques Rancière. These are the key democratic left theorists writing about rights politics. And I want to draw your attention, though, to a specific effect of this politics of origins, which is a pervasive time-space provincialism of historiographical and philosophical human rights scholarship. By time-space provincialism, I simply mean that the epistemic center of human rights intellectual thinking is temporally and geographically located in the West. So even if the timeline of the originary stories shifts, and this is what's been happening, right? So no one is going to talk about, in the last 30, 40 years, there's been this shift whereby, well, actually, not even 20, 30 years, I'd say 2 decades. That there's been this shift in which people are a bit worried about sort of linking human rights to Greek antiquity and, and sort of, Western civilization from time immemorial, and actually have moved to starting at the American Declaration and the French Revolution, and somewhere, some people, very few would even start from the Haitian Revolution, right? But actually, so that's the movement, by which I mean that even though the timeline has shifted, and Samuel Moyne, writing in 2010, dates the rise of the human rights revolution to the rise of Amnesty International in the 1970s. So this has already moved on. So you've seen these timelines shift, but the center of that intellectual thinking is temporarily and geographically located in the West. So even, as I was saying, if the timeline of the originary stories of human rights might shift, the location of that story remains steadfastly in place, and the geographical context of epistemic inquiry remains stationary. Now, the important work this time-space provincialism does is that invests epistemic authority in the global north, leading to a lack, and this is very serious, a lack of theoretical, philosophical, and conceptual attention to rights struggles in the global south, so that they remain at the realm of case studies. But I want to come back to that question with which I started the talk about rights politics in most of the world. I'm not going to talk too much about that. Feminist historical ontology is one of the ways, is the methodological tool I have to devise in order to do this work. So how to do this accounting or epistemic accounting of rights politics, I had to come up with feminist historical ontology, which actually, quite simple terms, is historical ontology plus politics of location. It's useful for the politics of location. So that's what the feminist historical ontology is. But I want to come back to that question of thinking about or telling different stories of rights politics. Now it turns out, okay, so I've been very sort of upbeat till now, right? But it turns out that you simply can't tell these stories of rights politics in most of the world without also engaging seriously with the question of anti-imperial epistemic justice. And you might ask me, why am I saying that? Because it's neither straightforward to talk about rights politics in most of the world, nor is it straightforward to talk about anti-imperial epistemic justice, because one comes up against a paradox. And the paradox is simply like this. To speak meaningfully about rights politics in most of the world is to necessarily invoke elements of anti-imperial epistemic justice, but also we cannot enunciate anti-imperial epistemic justice in any effective manner without retooling received theorizing of both rights and justice. So I'm not even talking about new concepts at this point. I'm simply talking about existing concepts are just don't provide us that space to do this work or enough elasticity. This is because, and here's the reason why. This is because dominant thinking on rights and justice tends to be mired in questions other than injustice and inequality. It's therefore unable to capture the alignment of the politics of rights and the politics of justice that emerges within subaltern mobilizations in most of the world, right? So because politics of rights is often seen as separate to the politics of justice. Standard Eurocentered conceptual thinking is unable to capture the alignment of the politics of rights and that of justice that emerges, as I said, in subaltern mobilizations, because it insists on a conceptual separation between the two, even though, by which I mean theories of rights and theories of justice. Even though some philosophers note that the philosophical discussions, say on global justice, for instance, are more or less already couched in the language of human rights. To a great extent, however, theories of rights are seen as separate in scope, form, and content from those of justice. Theories of rights are regarded as concerned with drawing up a distribution list of rights, while those of justice are deemed to be concerned with a more general distribution of kinds of things we prize: income, wealth, duties, rights, powers and opportunities, offices and honors. Overall, however, theories of justice are to do with some very general principles governing the basic structure of society in regard to the impact on the life prospects of and the enjoyment of primary goods by individuals. To a great extent, the scholarly responses insisting on the conceptual separation of rights and justice are informed by a recent set of North American theories of justice, and John Rawls being key amongst them. And I'm going to try and restrict my critique of John Rawls because I'm sure you've heard loads and loads of that critique. I'm not going through that, but I had to mention him anyway. Which are characterized, so these North American theories of justice, very influential and key framework for thinking about global justice, right, are characterized by their refusal to think about injustice as the starting point of their thinking. Additionally, they also refuse to acknowledge that subaltern struggles do take injustice as a starting point and playfully entangle rights and justice as inseparable sites and aims of struggle. Moreover, because of the unidirectional thinking and time-space provincialism that informs many of these theories, they fail to be attentive to the entanglement of rights and justice, as I said, within subaltern mobilizations, but significantly to questions of structural injustice as an epistemic site for theory building on rights and justice. In the Faces of Injustice, the political theorist Judith Shklar notes that all the proponents of what she calls the normal models of justice focus on identifying the institutional arrangements for perfect justice rather than founding their thinking on existing injustice and their remedies, right? So the starting point of thinking about justice is not thinking on what Amartya Sen calls transcendental institutionalism, right? So thinking about what are the perfect forms of justice possible rather than starting from this is the injustice and how do we overcome it. Common to the normal models of injustice, Shklar notes, is a complacent view of injustice, which takes it for granted that injustice is simply the absence of justice. And once we know what is just, we will know what all we need to know. The philosopher Charles Mills notes that the separation of rights from justice and injustice emerges from a long and particular history organized around what he calls racial liberalism. For him, the dominant thinking on liberalism is racial liberalism, which also privileges a mode of thinking that abstracts away from oppression. So that is my intervention around methodological abstraction. The problematic mode of idealizing abstraction, perfect conceptions of justice, for instance, is neither ideologically neutral, nor is it without material consequences. It erases and conceals actually existing oppression as a starting point for philosophical thinking and inhibits the development of conceptual tools necessary for understanding and dealing with its working. A key contradiction of Euro-North Atlantic ideal theories of justice, and they're mostly known as ideal theories of justice, effectively becoming the principal frameworks of philosophical thinking on global human rights and global justice, is quite simply, of course, that they're anything but global. Their methodological insularity from most of the world, their methodological nationalism, even though they talk in universalist terms, they're actually thinking about, look at their examples. They're based in a very particular part of the world, and they are only speaking about their problems, and even then, not so. Their obliviousness to questions of global structural inequalities and to the prevailing global coloniality and the foundational racial violence that organizes global politics within and among countries, while extraordinarily striking, is also hardly surprising. A case in point in the remarkable methodological insularity shown by the 20th century ideal theories of justice, and this is my Rawls moment, forgive me, from the scholarship on anti-colonial critique. So when all of this writing is flourishing, this is also the high point of a lot of anti-colonial scholarship. But of course, this work is completely methodologically insular to it. And this methodological insularity shown by the 20th century ideal theories of justice from the scholarship on anti-colonial critique and justice is, of course, which never refers to any of it in its writing. The methodological, and this is John Rawls' theory of justice, right, published in 1971. John Rawls based at Harvard. not very far from the discussions on the new international economic order, which is animating the globe at this time in the UN, and so on and so forth, or the publication of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, 1963. All of these texts are being published at the same time, but actually there's no reference to the fact that this is the kind of stuff which is animating questions of global politics. Charles Mills has powerfully called the epistemology, he doesn't call it methodological insularity, those are my words, but he calls this racial liberalism's insularity as a result of what he calls epistemologies of white ignorance. These epistemologies of white ignorance enable the philosophical refusals to ask questions about what forms of justice are possible in a historically unjust society. But it also springs from a hardwired colonial unknowing. You don't need to know. There's no need, right? About most of the world, and from debates on settler colonialism, racial and gender justice, which have been, of course, the subject of severe critique in our recent times. Oblivious of or even defying any interest in or evidence of what Edward Said has called contrapuntal thinking, a concern with epistemic simultaneity around the globe. The philosophical thinking on justice is in an ideal mode, eschews questions of transhistorical justice, racial justice, structural injustice, and even global economic justice. The latter a key concern, as I was saying earlier, in the debates and discussions on global human rights and justice that animated most of the world around the time that one of the major philosophical treatises on justice were being published and loaded around the world. By the way, the BBC calls the theory of justice as the most important philosophical text produced in the 20th century. The most. It has ranked it. When everyone's very fixated on ranking, right? Racial liberalism puts in place not only methodological abstraction, but also a number of exclusionary methodological, so these are some of them. Also puts in a number of exclusionary methodological paradigms, which keeps its conceptual distinction between the politics of rights, or the theories of rights, and the theories of justice intact. Methodological abstraction, methodological individualism, nationalism, whiteness, and so on, and methodological anti-blackness. Consequently, these are unable to either address or transform existing political economies of oppression and domination as they abstract away from oppression and existing structures of injustice. So therefore, you can see my quandary, right? In the sense that I'm left with, I have to theorize anti-imperial epistemic justice, in which I'm trying to think about the politics of justice and politics of rights, but neither theorizations of justice nor theorizations of rights are up to the task. So retooling received on mainstream theories of rights and justice therefore becomes crucial for articulating rights politics in most of the world, but also for reorienting theoretical thinking towards theorizing structural injustice and to acknowledging the epistemic difference instituted by anti-imperial and anti-colonial world-making. Okay, what do I have here? So, it's got lots of stuff in it, but don't worry, I will come back to it. Anti-imperial epistemic justice, I'll speak about that now, is actually a very specific intervention. There's a lot of conversation these days on epistemic justice, epistemic injustice. I mean, you literally can't turn your corner without somebody talking about epistemic injustice. But I mean, by anti-imperial epistemic justice, it is a very specific intervention. I do not mean prejudicial, individual, and micro-level instances of being institutionally unheard or unjustly treated that can be combated through methodologically conservative and ethically neutral intellectual resources, or indeed through clearing intellectual obstacles to a neutral view of social relations. That's how epistemic injustice is often thought about. And this is coming from the work of Miranda Fricker, of course, a feminist philosopher. Miranda Fricker's work on epistemic injustice, and this has now become one of the very important conceptual vocabularies to talk about knowledge production or being unheard. Just to give you a sense of how far it has reached, the other day, because it's a lots of people here are interested in critical theory. I think it was last week, I heard a lecture by Axel Honneth, and the title of the lecture was Post-Colonialism in the West, 2 steps back and 1 step forward. And so you can see it, it's on YouTube. It's a really interesting lecture. Of course, the title of the lecture got me interested. Axel Honneth talking about post-colonialism. Let me have it here. And of course, what he was talking about was that he spoke of the, like I said, it's a very interesting and thoughtful lecture. He talked about colonialism as being an external event in European consciousness. And despite the fact that you've had a whole series of emancipatory ideologies in the West, none of them have taken colonialism as their central starting point. So therefore, it remains on the peripheries, if at all, of what he calls the moral European universalism, or European moral universalism. And so therefore, he says this can't continue, and that Europe will need to provide corrections to its historical understanding and its clouding of consciousness. And that this will need to take place in universities and schools, whereby you need to kind of walk back to the ways in which the canon is studied, and so on and so forth. And he says this epistemic injustice of the clouding consciousness over colonialism will need to be accounted for. But then he says you can't do that work of accounting for this lack of critical consciousness, or the sort of the primary place of colonialism within European self-consciousness without theoretical resources. And here is where we part ways, because for him those theoretical resources will come from Europe, right? And I wanted to sort of say to him, well, you know, Julia has this conference next week where people are talking about the kinds of conceptual resources you need to do this work. You cannot fall back into Europe and say, this is what we're going to do. He also talks about, interestingly, about what you were saying earlier, Dilly, about anthropomorphism. Centrism, sorry, yes, anthropocentrism in European thought and how that needs to be overcome. But again, those resources need to come from European, and this is where. But I just wanted to just give you a sense of how epistemic injustice is sort of moving across and how people are kind of referring to it all the time. It's quite separate from how I'm thinking about it. The way anti-imperial epistemic justice is concerned with epistemic location, politics of location very important, and the material and ethical context, of knowledge production. This comes from the anti-colonial scholar Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who of course does a scathing critique of decolonial scholarship and sort of says you're not paying attention to the materiality, to the political economy of knowledge production, right? Who gives scholarship to whom? Where is this money based? Where are the postdocs based? Who is producing work? Where is this work being produced? Who's being published? And so on and so forth. And so therefore it is to do with epistemic location and material and ethical context of knowledge production, but also with epistemic presence of knowledge production from most of the world. It demands that epistemic interventions from most of the world must matter in a way that matters epistemically. By anti-imperial epistemic justice, I also mean to critique this hardwired colonial unknowing, which leads philosophers in 2024 to suddenly recognize that there is a clouding of consciousness in Europe around colonialism. And my question is, where have you been? And also the methodological insularity on the one hand, but also methodological nationalism. When people do talk about world making in the global south, think how easily even those critical, radical, democratic scholars, when they have to talk about the global south, they will fall straight into methodological nationalism. The problem with methodological nationalism and the many great men's stories of rights and justice that are told in its name is that not only are nation states among the chief violators of rights and justice through their security, development, and corporate apparatuses and interests, but also because of the low legitimacy of the nation state to represent subaltern groups who have historically been at the receiving end of irresistible state violence, both contemporaneous and historical. Key to anti-imperial epistemic justice, then, is firstly an insistence on conceptual production from most of the world. So this is where I log into your conference, because this is absolutely key. And one of the things that was very evident in your talk, Dilip, this morning was this sort of being stuck in this place whereby not having the conceptual language to articulate what is going on. And concepts, therefore, are not abstract entities. They help us to visualize and describe the world. And if you do not have the concepts outside of radical incommensurability or simple translation, right, those are the two traps. So either this is simply untranslatable, we will not engage. It's so radically different than another, we will not engage with you. You can stay in your own place and just be quiet and don't trouble us, right, and carry on. Or simple translatability. This is what it is. This is what it means. So an insistence on conceptual production from most of the world. And this is a matter of epistemic urgency. The glaring absence of a broad repository of concepts drawn from different historical and geographical and non-standard background contexts and conditions lies at the heart of coloniality of knowledge production. Not least because it keeps Eurocentrism alive, maintains racialized epistemic hierarchies, material inequalities and political economies of knowledge production, actively produces colonial unknowing, epistemic violence, and conceptual misdescriptions, aggressively insists on the unidirectional travel, simplistic translation, and radical commensurability of different worlds and forms of world-making, and authorizes and enacts powerful refusals of epistemic relationality and simultaneity across the globe. And even though they are now important and significant decolonizing interventions, focusing on what are sometimes called very quickly and I think quite unsatisfactorily theorizing from the global south. However, in my view, the problem lies not so much in producing theories from the global south, but in producing concepts from the global south. Concepts are the building blocks of theory. They make our world, as I was saying, visualizable and describable and discussable. And therefore, the work of theory building requires concepts able to capture different political and social imaginaries of life, living, and world-making in different locations around the globe. Otherwise, one is always only caught up through translation or made available through translation. And that also simplistic. Secondly, anti-imperial epistemic justice demands an insistence on epistemic presence and epistemic accounting of these most of the world concepts in ways that matter epistemically. How do they speak back to theory? The epistemic presence of rights politics, then, is crucial in this case. I'm talking about rights politics. I don't want to make it too abstract. Is to avoid, as I was saying, avoid categorizing rights struggles as local case studies and so on and so forth. And thirdly, anti-imperial epistemic justice is concerned with producing an epistemic shift in the sites of knowledge production from Europe, thought of as an epistemic, geographical, political, economic category to most of the world. And finally, it demands a careful and systematic imperative at speaking back to received and Euro-centered ethical, philosophical, and political conceptual languages that is oriented towards not only retooling them towards anti-imperial epistemic justice, but also so they become partakers. And this is so important because most of the time you're just sort of told, just as I said, sit in your room, you can do your thing, but this has no bearing on how we think about the world. But also so that they become partakers in a conversation on different forms of justice, rights, and world-making occurring around the globe. To sum up then, knowledge production and rights politics through the lens of anti-imperial justice, epistemic justice, is one that's invested in theorizing and challenging existing coloniality, structural injustice, exploitation, extractivism, oppression, and methodological nationalism. It is also one that's invested in producing conceptual descriptions from most of the world, and in this case, rights politics. So, here's some of the resources that I'm working with, but it's an open thing. There's a whole bunch of other things, but this is what I have at this point. I want to say two things, having reached here. In recent years, important intellectual interventions have drawn attention to the global coloniality of knowledge production. And anti-imperial epistemic justice draws and builds on these interventions, but it demands also that it's not enough to only critique the Eurocentrism and practices of extractivism backed by racialized universalism, but that there must also be concerted epistemic efforts to think systematically and epistemically about multiplicity of ways of worlding, and which must not be viewed as niche and exotic exercises, but rather as engage in changing what Marisol de la Cadena, the anthropologist, calls changing the baseline of politics. A key intervention for transforming the racialized, extractivist and colonial epistemic framework and blueprints underpinning The organization of global knowledge production, and this has been my key point here, is to produce concepts and conceptual descriptions of world making for most of the world. Now, I wish I could say that this whole insistence on producing concepts as being, the most kind of urgent, being epistemically urgent and being really important part of thinking about shifting the levers of epistemic knowledge, of epistemology is something that, is something that I have thought greatly and deeply, and it comes from here, that it's me. Actually, it isn't. So thinking about concepts and to produce new knowledges, to build the world anew is neither novel nor original. It has been a key facet of anti-colonial thinking. For instance, recall Frantz Fanon, writing in the concluding lines of Wretched of the Earth, he makes a specific observation on the intellectual content and inspiration of, he talks about, and he says this, it's right at the end, it's a question of third world starting a new history of man, a history which will have regard to the sometimes prodigious thesis which Europe has put forward, but which will also not forget Europe's crimes, of which the most horrible was committed in the heart of man. So comrades, let's not pay tribute to Europe by creating states, institutions, and societies which draw their inspiration from her. For Europe, for ourselves, for humanity, we must turn over a new leaf. We must work up new concepts. Right? This is central to all of that. And all that people pick up from Wretched of the Earth is a question of violence. But actually, it's about knowledge production. And that's something that's kind of missed out on this. Different points, as I said, in Wretched of the Earth, Fanon makes specific observations on the intellectual content and inspiration of these concepts. And this is so, so important. The new concepts are neither pulled out of Euro-centered intellectual repertoires, nor are they products of some populist abstraction or of ossified notions of the cultural, the traditional. Fanon is unequivocal that these concepts emerge from and also draw their intellectual inspiration from people's struggles for rights and justice and for freedom. Fanon's refusal to attach oneself to tradition or bring abandoned tradition to life itself is also shared by the other famous Martinican intellectual, Aimé Césaire, who famously wrote in a discourse on colonialism that for us the problem is not to make a utopian and sterile attempt to repeat the past, but to go beyond it. It's not a dead society that we want to review. We leave that to those who go in for exoticism. It is a new society that we must create. So, for the last 2 decades, I've been tracking the critical conceptual vocabularies of rights politics in most of the world. I said that to you, right at the start. This rights politics in most of the world appears as the politics of justice. It is therefore not the civilizational, racialized, minimalist, depoliticized, humanitarian politics of moralism and despair. Rather, it is one that is located within political struggles for freedom, rights, and justice, and underpinned by a conception of justice as non-exploitational and structural. This rights politics confronts two. Title of the book, and if you see, the cover will make sense for those of you who read other languages than English. This rights politics confronts two deeply inbuilt assumptions within global human rights politics, which I said earlier to you, the politics of origins and the time-space provincialism. My epistemic accounting, so that's one of the key tenets of anti-imperial epistemic justice, is that concepts from most of the world must appear as an epistemic presence and that there must be an epistemic accounting of them. My epistemic accounting of subaltern rights struggles has involved ethnographically tracking these struggles through northwest India and central eastern Pakistan. What unites these subaltern struggles spanning India and Pakistan is the critical vocabularies of rights that they employ to enunciate their rights and forge their rights politics and that of justice. All the subaltern mobilizations I've been tracking use the Urdu and Arabic word for a right, which is the word haq. And this is the word haq written in 9 different languages, the ones that I have tracked. As you all probably already know, the word haq is hardly confined to South Asia alone. It's extraordinarily cosmopolitan, appearing as the principal word for a right used right across the Middle East, North and East Africa, Iran, South Asia. It appears Turkey, and It appears in Hindustani and Urdu lexicon through the influence of Persian in the Indian subcontinent, where, of course, Persian was the state language before the arrival of British colonialism, where it cuts across geographical, religious, and linguistic boundaries to become the principal word deployed to claim rights by subaltern groups in northwestern India and Pakistan. And consequently, I've been tracking the deployment of the word haq. That's what I've been doing for the last 2 decades. To look at the ways in which and where it travels and how it's been used. The deployment of the word haq through the deserts of Rajasthan in northwestern India, where different subaltern groups have been mobilizing to demand rights to food, public information, gender and caste equality, and employment from the state. And Adivasi groups, indigenous groups, are demanding rights to sacred and ancestral forests, streams, rivers, and lands. The word haq doesn't recognize national borders and formations. If anything, it undermines these and the methodological imperatives which are framed around it. And so I have traveled with it further northwest into the subcontinent and into the central eastern province of Punjab in Pakistan, where for the last 2 decades, very poor peasants have been involved in a long struggle for land rights against the military in Pakistan, which is also the country's largest landowner, and to emerge as the most significant working class movement in post-colonial Pakistan. My conceptual work then, as I said, is fine, but the intervention has to be conceptual. My conceptual work on haq has involved documenting the different justificatory premises of haq that animate but also sustain these different political mobilizations, while also putting in place a particular relation to the self. These produce particular relationalities and subjectivities and puts in place a very particular right subject. The articulation of haq, both as an expansive language of claim-making but also as a demand for justice, occurs within and is embedded in powerful descriptions of existing structural injustices and powerful critiques of state corruption, corporate extractivism, dispossession, forced displacement to make way for development, industrial land and conservation projects. Land and conservation projects being extremely, these groups being very critical of them. The critical vocabularies of haq are therefore co-produced and fought within multiple and diverse encounters with developmentalism, militarism, state authoritarianism, statism, legal constitutionalism, and social movement activism. And therefore it's at the intersection of these, and not as some freestanding abstraction, a sort of, kind of idea belonging in time immemorial or something like that haq as a contemporary idea operates. It is not some harmonious, timeless concept that operates in hermetically sealed spaces of cultural authenticity. The justificatory premises of haq refuse methodological nationalism and statism by locating the authority and source of rights outside the nation state. And this is very different from liberal theorizing of rights, whereby there is an umbilical connection between state and citizenship. And that connection is our rights. Rights only come into being through the establishment of the modern nation state. And this is very different from that because they locate the authority and the source of rights outside the nation state, and even as they regard it as a responsibility of the state to protect and uphold rights. So that's quite different. For instance, while citizenship and legal constitutionalism is an important justificatory premise of rights, even though haq is used in the context of citizenship and justified and activated through citizenship, it's however not state-derived. It's not dependent on the state. This understanding of haq not only breaks out of the organic connection often drawn by legal positivists between the state and citizenship rights, but also places itself outside of the Arendtian paradox of the right to have rights, which operates when already known citizens, already citizens who are already in place, and also, of course, within methodological nationalism, with already assumed and existing categories of citizens and states. The justifications of haq are complex and uphold legal constitutionalism of rights while refusing rights, as I said, derivative of the state. In other words, haq doesn't only posit symmetric and correlative relations between one itself and the positive legal order of the state. Evidently, the non-derivativeness of haq from the state and entanglements of rights and justice has implications for mainstream and received theories of rights, right, which are very much thinking about in terms of state and citizenship and so on. Which tend to recognize, as I said, the existence of rights only if there are correspondence duty holder, the duty holder being the state. It also has implications for theorizing rights outside of methodological nationalism, individualism, since haq is not limited to claims to entitlements guaranteed by the state, and therefore it allows itself to be used for differently organized politics and social arrangements. The enunciations of haq, with their demand for different political arrangements, become visible in the non-dichotomous and relational connections that are drawn between individuals as bearers and claimants of haq and the public good. In sum, claiming haq signifies a cosmic inseparability and indivisibility from the public good, and consequently the public good is conceived as exceeding the welfare and interests of moral individuals and comes to include, for example, obligations to nature. So it exceeds humanism. The refusal of methodological individualism also draws attention to the conceptual connections between liberty and rights, which often rests on both methodological individualism but also statism. Consider, for instance, how Isaiah Berlin's two concepts of liberty are seen as a touchstone for thinking about liberty, and of course he theorizes liberty in relation to the state, and specifically as freedom from state interference. Berlin famously dismisses the other side of liberty, positive liberty, which is freedom, too, as constituting any legitimate grounds of liberty on the basis that it falls prey to the aspirations and goals of authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. However, even in this rejection, it's the vulnerability of positive freedom of autonomous individuals that concerns Berlin, and not the world-making aspirations wrought through collective political struggles of world historic groups. So methodological individualism is the unit of analysis in all of this. To be clear, the protection of individual from state power is, of course, paramount. I'm not sort of saying, let's go, towards authoritarianism. But as anti-colonial, black, indigenous and decolonial scholarship has shown, it's only the possessive elite subjects, and in particular the white liberal humanist man, who has ever experienced liberty as freedom from state power. Moreover, the racial liberalism and racial capitalism underwritten by the colonial, settler colonial and the post-colonial states has not only legitimized the violence of private accumulation of property, but also the theft of commonly held property. Importantly, though, the scholarship has also drawn attention to the different forms of collective world-making and communal ownership of property arrangements that existed outside of and direct opposition to settler colonial and racial capitalism. The articulations of haq and indigenous mobilizations in northwest India that I've been tracking also drew attention to the dispossession of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands by the state in the name of development, and to the overwhelming state violence directed at subaltern groups claiming collective rights, ownership rights over ancestral lands, forests, rivers, and streams. Through claiming their individual and collective ownership over communal lands, they are also asserting a political imaginary of freedom and liberty which is non-atomistic and extends to the collective well-being and not simply only sentient beings. The articulation of haq, both as an expansive language of claim-making but also as a demand for justice, occurs, as I said, and is embedded within various kinds of structural injustices. A striking transformation of the meaning of haq occurs when it's seized by Dalit and Adivasi women to articulate claim rights and gender justice. For instance, it was often brought up that how the word haq itself was masculinist and caste supremacist, and that upper caste men would use it to refer to their property rights only, and that it was unthinkable that it could be used by subaltern women to name and challenge existing structural injustices and intersecting oppressions, let alone call themselves as a subject of rights. Rights politics in most of the world is not a utopian, horizontal, power-free politics. Nowhere is. Like all phenomena, this rights politics is intersectionally gendered phenomena. The attention to conceptual work around the globe draws attention to the gendered conceptual life and work of concepts. And even while haq generates political possibilities and shifts normative horizons of rights talk, these normative possibilities are deeply gendered and marked by intersectional inequalities. It's worth noting that in each case of political mobilizations, and I've been tracking them for 20 years and looking across a whole range of them, I've not come across a single instance, a single rights movement mobilization, where the demand for gender equality came up organically within these, or was raised as part of a collectively raised demand for rights, always needed to be begged. Was there, but never as the primary question. Always needed to be begged separately as an additional question. So think about it, right? The labor's women caucus, right? The Conservative Women's Political Party, or the LGBTQ caucus within various, always separate, always secondary, always never asked. And there's something to be asked about. Why is it that certain kinds of inequalities are just, they just need to be begged separately? I want to emphasize that to speak of rights politics in most of the world and of being in the world is neither to remove them from ethical judgments. And this is not the same as judgmentalism or moralism. These are quite separate things. Or from ongoing philosophical disagreements. In fact, it is to center them at the heart of philosophical disagreement. And neither is it to fall into a romanticized mythical argument of this conflict-free sort of, understanding of these ideas somehow representing a golden tradition, a tradition that is being revived through an attention to the vernacular. Yeah, I've just got 2 minutes out. And I have in mind the recent dangers of co-optation of decolonial thinking, for example, by authoritarian right-wing groups. And I'm just thinking about the ways in which the Modi government, for example, has appropriated decolonial thinking, and some of, well, not thinking is giving them too much credit, by which I mean decolonial vocabularies for making very regressive and regressive political claims and arguments, but it's my view that there will always be co-optations of emancipatory. That's what happens to emancipatory languages by reactionary constituencies. But that the important thing is to always insist on an epistemic accounting of the specific politics and intellectual genealogies that undergird conceptual productions in different parts of the world, including from within social movements. Social movements are not power-free zones either. The theorizing of rights and justice in most of the world through the lens of anti-imperial epistemic justice is located in people's struggles for rights and justice. But it also draws on the work of anti-colonial thinkers who have refused any ossified view of culture or as custom or tradition, and have insisted on making the world anew after racialized man, nation, and rights. The work of conceptually theorizing rights politics in most of the world is a historically specific, situated, and conceptual enunciation located in people's struggles, and one which is firmly tethered to the broader project of anti-imperial justice.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that paper. We started 10 minutes late, so I'm going to add 10 minutes to our time, which gives us a healthy amount of time for questions. So I'll open up to our audience. Let's ask the first question. Yeah, please.
Question.
Could you just say what your name is so that I also know who I'm kind of speaking with?
I'm Yan Ling. I'm from Royal Holloway University. My question is not very relevant to this talk, because this talk sounds very complicated, very academic. I'm just wondering, when people they are talking about human rights, have you ever considered about the human obligations or responsibilities? Because when I heard now a lot of people they want to have their wages increased. So if everybody wants to got their rights and their benefits, so where does the money come from? So, and another thing is how like in modern society we should define like individuals' rights and common good. What is the boundary between two aspects? It seems, we need to have human rights, but what about the common good? To what extent should we follow common good or something like that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Should we take a few? It's just that it just seems like more people get a chance to ask questions. Otherwise.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Sure.
Yeah, I'm just going to comment something. It seems, it's the first time I hear about this, which seems quite interesting.
Thank you.
It seems something like I'm not sure if I understood it well, but it seems something akin to rights of existence.
Sorry?
Something like a right of existence.
Yeah.
When you start mentioning about this, I was wondering about like the practicalities in terms of how this works, and also the question that appeared in my mind, because obviously this is within the Islamic culture, right? So there's obviously this question about women within the Islamic culture. And if you can also speak a little bit about that, this, which seems so interesting, the premise of this, this right,
I think there's a third. Yeah.
Two questions which are thinking beside your paper.
Yeah.
I like your paper a lot. That was what I was saying, and also I suppose we're on the same page when it comes to generating concepts from our spaces and so on and so forth. I was thinking that the wonderful idea of haq that you put forward, that this is something that is in some sense self-derived, and it's not something that appeals to the state to grant something that the state defers or holds back or endows and so on and so forth. But alongside the question of haq in a hierarchical society is also the status of a person as to who can articulate haq. So it's related to the question of awqat, right? I mean, your status in society. And one of the things about making a claim on the basis of haq is to assert also that you have the status to make a haq. So these two things are joined at the hip. And I think that's the interesting thing which actually distinguishes it from rights discourse and so on and so forth, because to claim that something is your haq is at the same time a claim to status, right? And they go hand in hand. That was one thing. The other thing was, because I'm writing something on Fanon right now, and largely because Fanon was invoked so much in the decolonized agitation in South Africa. And then I began reading many of the Algerian critiques, critiques by Algerian Muslims of Fanon's work. And this Fujii Sli's work, for example, where one of the arguments that Algerian critics make is that Fanon really functioned like a Frenchman in that, where he doesn't recognize the existence of Islam. Islam is the elephant in his argument. And so when, for example, that rights come from popular struggles, for him the popular struggles are the struggles that are current, right? They're happening at the present, rather than the struggle of the Sufi brotherhoods against the Ottomans, which has been going on for much longer. So I think when we resort to thinkers as well, many of these contradictions are also fairly important in terms of engaging with them. There is no easy result, because this gives me no happiness actually to deconstruct Fanon. But the fact that Fanon is presented as, look, here is an alternative, and then you begin to read him, and you read him against the critiques from within a certain space, you arrive at a different understanding that you may, at one extreme, you can see him as a French Orientalist, right? So anyway, but that's just a comment.
Okay. Okay, thank you. No, thank you so much for your questions. Okay, the first question. Question of duties and obligations and rights and responsibilities. So, in some of the, I didn't have time to go through some of the justificatory premises of haq, but you would see that it also is sort of is not confined or only consistent with humanism, which means that there are obligations to nature, right? So there is already a very strong idea of obligation attached to it, and so on. So people are talking about obligations and rights, and so there is haq, but haq is not of an atomistic individual. So I think the starting points are quite different. So in that sense, it's not like me with this very clear border around myself, and then you cannot enter my space. Right, so it's not that kind of hyper-individualism that Pang was talking about in the morning. It's not that kind of an idea of who the person is. So conceptions of personhood are quite different. Having said that, that becomes certain ideas around personhood attached to individuals having rights also become important at times of conflict, right? In terms of interpersonal conflict, but also conflict in relation to the state. So those kinds of ideas of, of not stepping into the border and that this is the line whereby you can't and so on come into play, but they are not the kind of overriding ideas of who the person is and who the self is, okay? The question of, the other problem with, so the thing with always trying to, whenever I talk about rights, there's always this thing about, but what about the question of duty? And what about the question of obligation? I'm always a bit concerned about that, A, because it is within that liberal framework of rights and obligations, duties versus rights and so on and so forth. But this is also something which is picked up by authoritarian states quite a lot. Right? The moment you talk about rights, well, what about duties? And people, and this Modi has written this whole thing on why people are talking about rights all the time and they should be talking about their duties. So I also think that's why I was sort of talking about the consequences, that some of this argumentation, these might actually appear as quite abstract ideas, but actually they have a lot of traction on the ground. And so we have to be quite careful as to how ideas and discourses play out in particular kinds of politics and sort of withdraw ourselves from that. I'm not taking part in that because that's how it's picked up, right? So if you see my point. So I'm always a bit concerned about this constant binarism of rights as sort of seen in a very particular idea of personhood and contrasted radically with the idea of duty and obligation, right? Whereas haq actually includes both. And that's what makes it so interesting as an idea, because it refuses that binarism. It refuses that particular way of understanding the world. So I'll leave it at that. The question of haq as sort of existence is quite interesting because it's quite close to that, because people always sort of say there are other words, but the couple of things about haq that are very striking is that A, it's used by subaltern groups, whereas other words for rights, which do exist in, not so much in the Urdu lexicon, because there is one word, haq, but in various Indian languages, right, it's always contrasted as those are the words used by people who are educated. Adhikar, for example, is another word. But they often say, oh, those are the people associated who have some kind of status, who have some kind of power already, have some kind of social capital, being able to mobilize, whereas haq belongs to us. And that it can, and we need to snatch it. And even if they take it away from us, we'll snatch it right back. Because there is something inherent. And that's quite extraordinary, which is not something, therefore, not given by the state. So it doesn't, then therefore it's not non-derivative. But also what you were sort of saying is, how does it practically work, right? It works because it is articulated to. So one of the other things, like, unlike a lot of decolonial scholarship, and I have a lot of sympathy for it, I have friends who are, decolonial scholars, and I talk to them all the time and so on, is that a lot of that work, particularly I'm talking about Escobar, Arturo's work, and so on, is very much thinking outside of the state. And there is an absolute non-engagement with the state by, particularly Escobar's work, which is very much around indigenous groups in Southwest Colombia, and so on and so forth. Whereas these groups are directly targeting the state. Because of their subaltern status, there is nobody else who will hear them. You see, so, I remember one of my, my PhD supervisor, Sudipta Kaviraj, would often say that, that the Indian state is a poor man's welfare state, is because that's the only entity that will listen. So therefore, all of that is targeted at the state. So haq then is used as a language of rights claiming rather than this very formal legal institutionalist language, right? Yes, that's right. So it would be that, and it's also used to ask for entitlements from the state. So right to work, right to food, land rights, and so on and so forth are very much, and they have been put into public policy. And they have come through these movements and through these articulations. It is an extraordinary word because, unlike most of the other parts of the world where it appears primarily in terms of Islamic jurisprudentialism, in the Indian subcontinent, it actually goes across religious, geographical, linguistic lines. And it's not only, think about it, Pakistan, lingua franca of Pakistan is Urdu. And only 8% of the population of Pakistan actually speak Urdu. In India, less than 2% of population speak Urdu, which is the word in the Indian context is associated with the word haq, of course it's Arabic, Turkish, classical Hebrew, and so on and so forth, right? But less than 2%, but the word has that kind of span that groups from across different paths. That I was in the northeastern state of Manipur a few years ago, and people spoke of haq. I was quite surprised, because I didn't expect it to find it so close to the Chinese border, talking about this word haq, which it's not in any part of their lexicon. So there is this sort of this word has this kind of recognition across, and it crosses linguistic, religious boundaries, and so on and so forth. And so it's not only linked with Islamic jurisprudentialism, but it is gendered. It is gendered.
It's related to haqiqat, which is haqiqat, haq,
yeah.
Is really, which is truth.
That's right, yes, that's right, yeah. So it has kind of, so some of my work has involved in actually etymologically tracking it through the centuries and how the changed meaning occurs as it travels through different locations and so on. And so, of course, it, classical Hebrew comes into the Quran. From Quran, it moves across into post-Islamic and poetry, Aramaic, Median, and so on. But the thing about, it is a gendered word, and that links with Philippe's question, that to stake a claim to haq is to stake a claim to status, right? And I think that's where the power lies, but that's where the conflict lies too, right? Because it's, rights politics are extremely conflict-driven, and they're conflictual. I mean, even in this room, if I were to say to you, I have my rights, you look at me a bit weirdly, right? So you can imagine that if you are in this sort of, space where some of the examples that, that Philippe pointed out this morning, and I totally recognize them because I had people in my, like I said, it's been 2 decades of tracking these ethnographically, sort of telling me, Dalit women telling me that they had to pick up their shoes and walk in front of where the panchayat house is, where what's it called? The office of self-government at the village level, which is voted for by the villagers, whereby those women could not walk if there were upper caste men sitting outside, right? So that with their shoes on, so they had to take off their shoes and walk across. So I'm just sort of saying, in that context, to be able, and this is what Jacques Rancière calls the subjectification, right? In the sense that rights languages are subjectivating, right? In the sense that they produce a kind of relationship to the self in his critique, which Arendt and Agamben, for example, pay no attention to because they are only focused on the negativity of rights. But actually, that rights discourse produces a very particular relation to the self, which is this powerful relation. Sorry.
Would you say that then there's kind of a determinate relation in which women can access this?
Well, all concepts are gendered, and this is no exception. All concepts across the world. Therefore, to talk about rights in this country, I mean, women got rights in this country in 1928, right? Or so on. And so what I'm saying, all concepts are gendered. I was in Geneva some time ago, a couple of months ago, and they were celebrating the 50th year of women receiving the vote, right? This is out of Europe. So I'm just sort of saying all concepts are gendered. And that is why the work of producing concepts requires us to think about concepts as occurring in a field of power and not as abstract. And therefore my critique of methodological abstraction, because it doesn't allow you to look at that conflict and look at the power struggle. So all of these are very conflictual concepts, but it is a language. It's a critical vocabulary which allows one to make a particular claim to oneself. But that claim, is that claim to status in that articulation, is a very risky, injurious laden, and conflictual. And I don't want to minimize any of this. But it is also something which has produced a whole, what I'd call a kind of at some point when I felt more courageous, I don't use that language anymore, but in this audience I can, you'll forgive me, a rightscape in many parts of the world where people have been using that language of rights in order to make particular claims. And that, having said that, we're talking about in terms of gendered, I said it's gendered because that question of gender equality is fought for, is demanded, but it doesn't occur as a primary demand. It's always secondary. And one needs to ask as to why that happens for particular groups of people who are unable to mobilize a critical mass of support in their favor. Always happens. And across the world, you see it. It's not only in this particular case, and we need to ask why that's the case.
I'm really sorry, but I'm afraid that in order to have other questions of the speakers, we're going to have to call it there. Thank you so much again, Sumi. And if you don't mind,